So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this presentation given to you by the New Hampshire Library Association Technical Services Committee. So the first part of today's meeting is going to be a presentation on 6XX subject access fields, and the end will open it up to questions related to our presentation or anything technical services related. So if you want to pop questions into the chat or unmute at the end, that would be great. My name is Angela Brown. I'm the technical services librarian at Amherst Town Library and the chair of the committee. And I'll have my co-hosts introduce themselves. I don't think we can hear you, Anne.
Nope. While Anne figures that out, I am Martha Simmons. I'm Technical Services Librarian at the Hooksett Public Library in Hooksett.
And I'm Alex Planchak. I am the Head of Technical Services at the Manchester City Library.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, I'm Ann Murphy. I'm the Head of Technical Services at the Bedford Public Library, and welcome to this committee meeting.
All right, so I'll get us started with 6XX subject access field, which is a really fancy MARC way of saying subject headings and genre headings. And you've all probably have seen these before. So let's see. So this is kind of a really thorough basic structure of a 6XX field. So when you have these, when you see these in MARC records, you're going to see 600, 650, 651, 655, and these are the main part of the heading. Followed by that are some indicators. The first indicator really varies by heading. For example, in the 600 field, 0 would be for a surname, 1 for a forename, 3 for a family name. And then for 650, 651s, and 655s, it's usually left, the first indicator is usually left blank. The second indicator is same across all the headings, and that just tells you what thesaurus the heading is coming from. A lot of the time you'll see 0 for Library Congress subject headings, 1 for Library Congress subject headings for children, medical subject headings, etc. There's a whole list of these. These aren't, it's not comprehensive here. And then the subfield codes, so you know, A, B, C, etc. also vary by type of heading. A is usually always the main part of the heading. For example, a topical, genre, or name heading. D usually means some sort of date. It kind of varies what type of date by the heading. V is usually form subdivision, and of course there are many, many more. Oh, and there's my little example, as you probably have all seen in MARC records, different examples of 6XX fields. So I'm going to talk to you about the 600 field personal name. Personal names are also found in MARC fields 100, the main entry, or 700, the added entry, but most names can be used as subject headings as well. For example, a name in LC's name authority file may be used in the 600 field. Personal names can include names of persons, names of families, fictitious and legendary persons or characters, and real non-human entities like Lassie. The work is about, so if you see a 600 field in a bib record, you can assume the work is about the person named in that field. For example, a biography, or they're featured prominently in the work. And subfields may be present, so you might see, and you'll see more examples of these on the next slide. D would have a date associated with the person. And of course, these headings may be subdivided, but not by a biography. So a biography, autobiography, or memoir would just use the person's name as the subject heading without any subdivisions. And then you might see something like a 655 genre for genre heading for biography or other headings, 650 headings or other headings in the BIM record that are subdivided by biography, but not the heading itself. And you can find more details about basic subject cataloging in the resources section. So here are some examples of personal name headings. So a personal name can just be a forename, like the Banksy example. It can be the more traditional surname forename, which you see all the time. And then it can also be a family name. You'll also see dates associated with a name. They can be open or closed to indicate birth and death dates. For in the dates example, the Coretta Scott King was born in 1927 and passed away in 2006. Or in the case of John Sanford, it's a really detailed date. So there was probably a lot of different John Sanfords. So they used a little bit more detail in the date to distinguish this particular John Sanford. And you'll also see numbers and titles and words associated with a name. Those are very common subfields, like in the Queen Elizabeth example. And the Percy Jackson example is just telling you that it's a fictitious character in the C subfield. And as I said before, personal names can be subdivided by form or general subdivisions depending on the work. So, you know, if a novel features Rosalind Franklin, it would have a subdivision of fiction. Or if it was a critical essay about Octavia Butler, it might have her name with the general subdivision of criticism and interpretation. And Library of Congress subject, the Library of Congress subject heading manual for free-floating subject headings subdivisions will indicate if the heading can be used for a name. And that's where you'll find where the biography subdivision cannot be used under a name, but there's obviously other subfields that it can be used for. So we'll move on to topical term.
Okay, that's me. So a topical term, a 650 heading, is going to be really the most common you're going to see in a record as far as what the subject is. So it's when the entry element is a topical term, what it's about. So as Angela mentioned, the first indicator after the 650 is usually left blank, meaning no information provided. You can use numbers for, like, I think it was 1 for main subject and 2 for not main subject, but that's really granular. People don't really put that information in, so you'll see it blank almost all of the time. The second indicator, also, as Angela discussed, is the thesaurus from which the term comes. The subfields, you'll see a lot of these in 650 fields. And so the A is the first term, what it's about. And then you'll see different ones after that. B is the form, so it might be fiction or something like that, biography. X is a general subdivision, different, like a more specific topic within the heading. Y is chronological, so dates, and then Z is geographic. So on the next slide, I have some examples of this. The first two look very similar. You'll see that the indicators are different. 0, the first one is the Library of Congress subject headings. And the form is juvenile fiction because it's a either children's or teen book, probably teen by the topic. And then the indicator 1 is the children's subject headings. So you wouldn't specify juvenile, it just is subdivided by fiction. The next one comes from a vocabulary called the homosaurus. It's queer terms. So, and it's very specific. So in this case, bisexual disabled people. I think if you've worked with BIB records before and looked at different subject headings, you'll know they're not generally this specific. So it's a very nice vocabulary for that. What else? and then I showed the different ways you can subdivide the headings. So a form heading in the acceptance and commitment therapy would be handbooks, manuals, etc. And an example of the X subdivision under American fiction would be African American authors. So it's more specific than just American fiction. And then history and criticism is more specific than that. Landscape painting American has a date subdivision of 19th century. And the political activist heading has a geographic subdivision, United States, and further subdivided by form, it's a biography. So those are some examples. And I will get that link for the chat.
I got it, Alex.
I think you're on, Martha.
Hello, everyone. So here we have 651, which is for geographic names. I didn't list the indicators here because they're similar to the 650s. So that same link in the resource section will take you to the specific indicators that you'll need. The first one is always 0 for this, and then the second one gives you the sources. So 651s are similar to 600s and 650s, but they refer to geographic terms. They should be used when the location is the subject of the work, kind of like the personal name. And it's when the work takes place predominantly in that location, or it otherwise features that specific place. So it's not general terms for natural features and things, but it's for proper names of places people live and do things, like the specific name of a park, or geographic features and astronomical bodies like Mars, or a specific comet. One distinction to make is that while the 651 includes cities or oceans and things like that, it doesn't include businesses or religious organizations. So for those, you'd want to use the 610, which is a subject heading for corporate names. And then 651 also doesn't encompass fictional locations. So this is something that threw me off a little initially, because it seems like any other location, but those go in 650 topical terms. So my one example would be Dune, imaginary place in the science fiction novels. Subfields are always going to be present in this field. So the first one that is mandatory is subfield A, and the others you'll see are just like the 650 ones, where you have a subfield B, X, Y, and Z. And on the next slide, I will go over those in more detail. So A is required. That is where you put your geographic name. And if you have one that has a parenthetical notation, you just want to leave that all how it's constructed with the parenthetical note not in a separate subfield. That's something that sometimes people tend to want to do, and you just want to leave it as Pompeii extinct city, and it doesn't go into a separate subfield. So these subdivisions can be combined together to describe the scope and the focus of the work. So you'll see them often piled on top of each other, as some of these examples show. One of the fun examples here that has a lot of them also highlights the subfield Y, which is chronological subdivision. So that adds in the time period that is being discussed in the work. So you have here and it's the second example under subfield Y. So you have a comic book or a graphic novel that is about the social life and customs of Japan, but during the specific time period of 1912 to 1945. So you can see how they can get constructed with a lot of different subdivisions that kind of add layer upon layer to the topics that are being discussed, but it's always in relation to a specific place that the work is about. And finally, you might also encounter headings that contain an additional geographic term. They also typically occur in conjunction with subfield X. So this second place that's being mentioned in subfield Z is part of the overall topic that's being discussed, which would be in subfield X. And in this example here, so we have both Japan and South Korea contained within the same subject heading. And in this case, the work is about Japan, so it comes in subfield A. And then it's dealing with the topic of foreign relations with South Korea. So that is kind of geographic names, very similar to personal names or topical. 650. And then 69X fields. You're never going to see an X. That just indicates that there are several fields beginning with 69 something. And these are for topical, geographic, personal, or corporate names that are of local interest to your organization. They're not authorized and don't necessarily follow standard guidelines, and they're also not indexed. So they're really they're not going to be of interest to the larger cataloging community necessarily. So they're not going to exist in controlled vocabularies or need to be shared to OCLC necessarily, but they're important names and places for discovery in your communities and for your special local collections. So they are very important, but not everybody needs them. So when you create a local subject heading, you may construct them using controlled vocabulary terms, which is encouraged, but you might also be using uncontrolled headings and terminology as well, and that's perfectly fine. So we'll see some examples illustrating that on the next slide, but just a quick note is that the 690s also use the same indicator and subfield code guidelines that the other headings that we've just discussed do, the non-local ones. So you can use the same rules for creating these 6.9 headings as you use in those. So just like in the other 600 fields, you have various subfields. And the major subfield to note for them is subfield 2, where you enter the source of the heading, and that's generally your institutional code that your library would create, or the word local. So here are some examples of the various fields and what you might use them for. So we have 690 topical term, and that's like the 650. And in this example, Manchester has used, they used this heading for all of their items that are part of their New Hampshire collection, so they can be found quickly in their catalog or in the system for the staff. And another example, this one uses uncontrolled terms as well for constructing their heading, is the one that I made up from Amherst Town Library. It's the second example, the 697. And they decided to make a summer beach reads display. So they wanted it to be easy to locate in the catalog or to create into a visual carousel to share on their website or social media, for example. And that heading can easily be removed when the display is over with. So it's a great use for this type of local subject heading, topical. And just a note on the subfield there. So that's subfield 2, which is the source of the heading. And so for this pretend example, it's ATL to show that it's Amherst item specifically that this applies to, not a heading from any other library in the consortium. So geographic and personal names are very common 6-9 fields to employ, 691 being the geographic and 696 being personal names. Those are really common for local history and areas that you might have local works that deal with. And the final thing that I want to mention is the 591 field, which is for local notes. So this is, I know it's not a 600 field, but it is local. And so it's similar to the 500 note field, but the 591 should be used instead of the 500 if the note is specific to your organization. For example, donation notes are a very common reason for adding a local note. A little example for the Trekkies in the session here. And if you use the 500, then others might assume that all of the items attached to that record or formats of that work, including other libraries' copies or on a shared interlibrary loan database, are going to have the attributes that are detailed in the note. So if it's a particular note to that one copy and your library, then it should go in the 591 local note field instead. So there's geographic and local subjects.
And that brings me up. Welcome, everyone. I'm covering the 655 genre forms. This particular heading is interesting because this type of heading is a subject version, but it's different than the others in that it describes more of a type of work. What kind of work is being cataloged? These are a type of work like detective and mystery stories or constitutions. They're kind of collocated together in a kind of work. It can be described, it basically describes a work's style, plot, theme, and physical characteristics. The Library of Congress worked for many years to develop terms to describe what a resource is rather than what it's about, as most subject headings do. They describe what it's about, but 655s are specifically kind of saying what it is. And many in the bibliographic community recognized that these particular terms were valuable and requested the Library of Congress establish policies for their use. And as a result, the Library of Congress developed a number of discipline-specific guides, ones such as like the thesaurus for graphic materials. And they also support the use of third-party thesaurus terms, such as those for works of fiction, moving images, and works of art. The MARC coding that you'll see in the examples after this are taken from a couple of resources that are listed in the resources slide. And one is the MARC format for bibliographic data by the Library of Congress, and the other is the bibliographic formats and standards produced by OCLC. As you see in the slides, many of these things were created by convention among bibliographic communities, and I'm going to be discussing, for example, the first choice of indicator here in the first examples are between blank and 0, and these are used to describe the kind of heading. One is a basic heading and one is a faceted heading, and the second indicator 0 to 7 identify the type of thesaurus that's being used, the thesaurus itself, and they're often described in an acronym. You'll see that in a second. We can go to the next slide, Angela. Thank you. So in the next examples, you'll see give you an example of an alphabet book. That's really a type of book, not about alphabets, it's a type. And then, so this is also an example of a basic heading where you have the first indicator was blank, second indicator 0, and the first field is A, and it's all filled in, and that's a general genre kind of heading. This is taken from the Library of Congress also. This second indicator 0 is taken from the Library of Congress subject heading thesaurus, and that's where you see that alphabet books comes from. The second example is an example of a heading that is a basic heading. It has a form subdivision, and the second indicator 4 determines that there's really no source for the listing of this heading. So it's used and we can adapt it, but that's why you get the second indicator form. The next two examples, both 65.7s, historical fiction and the fiction one, are still basic headings, but you'll see that they have a subfield 2, which describes a thesaurus. And as an example, the first one is the guidelines on subject access to individual works of fiction, drama, published in 2000, and it was by the Chicago American Library Association in Chicago. And it's not has not been updated since then, but it's still being employed. The second example you see is the LCGFT, and that is from the Library of Congress, genre form terms and library archival materials. And you can find these headings in the Library of Congress subject headings. The last example is a little bit more tricky. I have to say I took this strictly from a resource because it is one that is not commonly used, but this particular heading identifies that you see the first part is 0, 655.0 means that it's a faceted heading, and that it has a second indicator 7 tells you what thesaurus it's used in. In this one, the Art and Architecture thesaurus produced by the Getty Research Institute, and they have very specific codes that they go by and how they describe things, and so the thesaurus sort of governs how this code gets broken out. Okay. So the next slide is about common authority files. The majority of our authorities come from the Library of Congress. We refer to that one as essentially the source of United States authorities. And the subject authorities, when you go to the Library of Congress authority file, you'll see a drop-down list of the search under the search box, where you'll see the subject, name, and title authorities listed, name, title, authorities, and keyword. But you won't see the last two, which is the genre forms and the Library of Congress and the annotated children's catalog. Those are held within the authority file, but you won't actually see them listed, but you will see them listed on the right-hand side column that is referred to as the type of the heading. So they're in the headings, they're listed, you can discern between them. And so you can see that when you go into the headings. The Library of Congress genre form terms is listed there in the, you'll see the link there. It was last updated recently. Those terms are being employed and updated on as much as they can. And the guidelines, as I said, was published in 2000. It's still being employed. And you're best to keep up with headings as they come forward and are updated at that location below. Subject headings, faceted vocabularies, just keep up with changes. All right, and that's the end of my sword.
All right, this was my slide. So I will just briefly, go over other controlled vocabularies. It's just examples, so I'm not really going to talk about them one by one, but the slides will be available for you to explore those links. Some of the ones that aren't linked are RVM, the French subject headings, and Bilindex, which is Spanish subject headings. Yours is just a general vocabulary, been around a long time, often kind of redundant with other subject headings. And then also you can develop your own controlled vocabulary within your institution at GMOCs. If we have something that we all use in our libraries, we use the subfield 2 GMOCs to indicate that. And the last link is really just to let your eyes glaze over how many different vocabularies that the Library of Congress recognizes in their list that you will see. Well, you really won't see them in MARC records. A lot of them are pretty rare, but they are allowed to be in the records. They are recognized. So that's it for me.
So when you're looking at your local catalog, you have some decisions to make. What to keep, what to add, what to delete when it comes to subject headings. So what to keep, no brainer, controlled vocabularies and thesauruses, LCSH, everything we've talked about today. I think for the most part, it's safe to keep those. What to add. So, a lot of us have kind of old or incomplete records in our systems, and in a perfect world, it's great to be able to add some missing subject or genre headings, because sometimes they don't have any. I've come across some like that. Sometimes they have been updated, so you can grab them from there, but other times they might not have. So it's kind of nice to be able to apply a couple headings to it, just to make it more searchable in your catalog. Excuse me. And also, as we've talked about, add local headings. What would be useful for your community? Local author headings, local history subject headings or genres that are not represented in controlled vocabularies. And also remember to document these. In GMILCs, we document any local subject headings so that we're all on the same page with it, so people come in and new people come in and they can see what's going on with these headings, so they're not getting deleted. So moving on to what to consider to deleting. So this can be a little tricky, but occasionally you'll see headings come in that have duplicate headings, and I think it's a good practice to try to delete those if you can. Obviously, headings with spelling errors, we see these all the time. Every catalog in the world have spelling errors in them, especially in subject headings. So, either delete them or, even better, try to correct those. And also, you'll see these occasionally if you download records from OCLC, that sometimes they'll come in with really local headings from another institution that really only make sense to that local institution. And it's, I think, best practice to go ahead and delete those. They don't mean anything to your community. You probably have your own headings you want to include. You don't need some other random institutions. And there are a few gray areas. So several years ago, we started seeing a lot of fast headings, and these are kind of, they're developed by the Library of Congress. It's kind of a separate program from your traditional LCSH. They're faceted headings. You probably have seen them. They're kind of ugly. And the GMOX libraries kind of went back and forth about whether to keep these or not. We ultimately decided to keep them in case they ever became useful. That hasn't happened yet, but we figured if they do become something useful for our catalog, we don't want to have to go back and add them. And then there's also the BISACs, which are kind of these vendor created subject headings, and we do delete those because they don't really link to anything in our catalog. They're ugly and they don't really serve our patrons that well. So we delete those, and we do that kind of in an automated way. So occasionally we do have to do them individually, but they can be deleted automatically. And then again, if you download records from OCLC and maybe other sources as well, sometimes you'll see these really strange machine generated headings, and they usually have a subfield as a second indicator 8, and they're usually just duplicates of like headings that are already in the MARC record. So those are usually safe to delete as well. And my little note at the bottom, it's really best practice not to delete legitimate subject or genre headings, especially when you're copy cataloging and another catalogers have already done the hard work of applying the headings. It's best practice not to delete their work. Exceptions can be made, of course, such as when the subject heading is misapplied. This happens, or in the case of spelling errors. And one last thing I want to note, all of this is like, a perfect world. And you really have to think about your time and personnel considerations when you're doing this type of work. Are there trained or trainable staff that can make these decisions? And do they have time to do them? You know, you don't have to do it all, but I think it's good practice to try to implement some of these suggestions. So here's a resources link. I will send these slides out to the NAES list so you can click on all of these great resources. These are all free except for the guidelines, the GSAFD, which is a print work, but all of this is free. The Library of Congress subject heading manual is free in PDF form. You can look, it's actually pretty useful. It goes into, if you're copy cataloging it, you might not need to reference it very often, but I've found it handy in the past. And there's a few other things. And also great, this basic subject cataloging using LCSH course, again, free, a free self-guided course you can take to learn a little bit more. So that's our presentation portion. And I will open it up to questions. And I do thank you all for listening.